Do you accept that if you retain a currency which is another country's, another country also retains, that it will constrain your freedom of economic and financial manoeuvring?
Well, can I just point out that the sterling is Scotland's currency as well at the present moment. It's not the property of George Osborne. Yeah, you'd have to have a sustainability arrangement, the sort of thing we spelled out in the Fiscal Commission report, with Joseph Stiglitz and another Nobel laureate, Jim Mirrlees, set that out. You'd have to have a sustainability arrangement, but that's what you would need. You wouldn't have to have oversight of either Scotland's budget or, for that matter, Scotland having oversight of England's budget. You just need a sustainability in terms of borrowing, in terms of overall debt levels. But listen, last year, Scotland relatively was $4 billion relatively better off than the UK, so that we've got a lot of freedom to manoeuvre on the income and expenditure side of our accounts.
Yeah, but hang on a minute. You would be the tail. England and whatever else is left would be the dog. The idea that in some way you could tell the Bank of England what fiscal policy was to be would be nonsense. You'd be the people who'd be being told what you could and could not do.
Well, the Bank of England is operationally independent at the present moment. It runs monetary policy. It's not told what to do by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So, that wouldn't change. The Bank of England remains operationally independent as far as monetary policy is concerned. Where we control is fiscal policy. We control Scotland's taxation and Scotland's spending.
Within certain limits. Within limits. And that's not independence.
Well, the point I was making, let's just take last year as an example. If Scotland's relatively better off by £4 billion, as we were last year, according to
Which, come on, is not very much money, actually.
Well, in Scottish terms, £4 billion is a lot of money. I mean, with £4 billion...
But in UK PLC terms, it's not.
No, but in Scottish terms, we could have done a huge amount with £4 billion. We could have increased capital spending to revive the economy. We could have borrowed less, which might be a good idea at the present moment. We could have put some into an oil fund to save for the future, like the Norwegians have done. We could have done all that with £4 billion.
Everything is constrained by the reality that you live within an arrangement which is governed by the Bank of England, which you will not control.
Well, the monetary policy would be run by the Bank of England. The taxation and spending would be run in Scotland by the Scottish Finance Minister.
But limited by the realities imposed by the much bigger entity south of the border.
Yeah, but what I'm pointing out, if we take last year as an example, we'd have had that £4 billion flexibility, which, believe me, in Scottish terms, is a lot of money. It's like, almost £40 billion in UK terms. We could have done a great deal to revive the economy. I believe the essence of economic independence is to control your taxation, control your spending. That's what allows you to revive your economy and develop a fairer, more prosperous society.
Well, let's look at what it would actually look like. Would you have a central bank?
Well, the platform that we put forward would be the Bank of England would operate as the central bank for both England and for Scotland. Certainly you'd have a monetary authority in the same way that Luxembourg, as an independent country, had a monetary authority when they shared a currency with Belgium for over 80 years.
But the problem with all this is you cannot, if you do not absolutely control your currency, your central bank, or whatever you want to call it, cannot be the lender of last resort. Well, not possibly.
The Bank of England would have that central bank function. That is the point. Scotland would have a monetary authority.
So you get into trouble and the Bank of England will bail you out?
Well, I mean, lender of last resort is what central banks do. I mean,
it's a jolly funny kind of independence. Well, hello, everybody. We are independent, but we've got to be bailed out by the Bank of England.
Well, let's just look at the examples. The one I gave in Belgium and Luxembourg worked for 80 years. In that time, they ran different tax rates, different economic policies. Luxembourg became a very, very prosperous country.
No, the Benelux were a union. They were a kind of union. You're not proposing a kind of union with England.
Sorry, Benelux, Belgium and Luxembourg were independent countries who had shared a currency. That's what Benelux was. And there's a perfect example of how it could operate between Scotland and England. You say we wouldn't control the Bank of England. I'm pointing out the Chancellor of the Exchequer doesn't control the Bank of England. It's operationally independent. And as far as being the lender of last resort is concerned, yeah, but what's the advantage to the rest of the UK from Scotland sharing a currency? Well, 40 billion protection for sterling from oil and gas, 5 billion protection from whisky exports.
Well, hang on a minute. You also happen to house the two worst banks from the bank crisis, HBOS and RBS. And are you telling us that your independent Scotland would have been able to sort that out?
Well, what I'm telling you is hopefully we'll have supervision arrangements which wouldn't allow that to happen. Hopefully that's what's been brought into place now, as opposed to having the failures in Westminster policy that allowed that to happen.
Not many people are going to go for independence if the word hopefully has to be attached to that.
OK, well, let's just talk about HBOS. I think the clue is in Halifax, Bank of Scotland. I mean, we're talking about a system where 95% or so of the liabilities of these organisations weren't in Scotland, the domestic liabilities, but were south of the border. They weren't saved to bail out Scotland. They were saved because the British banking system would have collapsed if they hadn't invested equity. Equity, incidentally, which the Chancellor of the Exchequer still says is going to get back.
These are still two global banks located in Scotland. An independent Scotland would have to deal with their mastery and what they would do about them. And the fact is, as they stand at the moment, how much of the 60 billion that we've put into those banks would you pay back to us as you go independent?
Well, two things. One is, in terms of the expenditure and revenue for Scotland, the cost of the banking intervention, our share of it's in that statement already. And secondly, it was the policy of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, leader of the No campaign, who allowed these banks to collapse under his watch, Alistair Darling, that the money would be returned in terms of the sale of the banks. That is still the policy of the present Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Hang on a moment, because it was you who wrote to Sir Fred Goodwin in May 2007, I want you to know that I'm watching events very closely on the ABN front. It is in Scottish interest for RBS to be successful, and I'd like to offer any assistance my office can provide. Good luck with the bid. Yours for Scotland, Alex. If RBS had taken any advice from anybody else but you, they would never have bought ABN AMRO.
Well, the difference is I wasn't in charge of the authorities at the time. Alistair Darling was. Remember, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer.
You're the same Alex Salmond who wrote this letter and is sitting here in the studio. That's the same man.
Well, I think, you know, in terms of political responsibility, I rather think the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was in charge of the Financial Service Authority, who allowed the Royal Bank's capital ratio to go to 2%, bears a bit of the responsibility for what happened.
You're preferring the word responsibility to the word judgment. Well, and the judgment that this was a good idea was wrong.
Yeah, well, it's very easy to look at a letter. I'm saying responsibility lies. If you've got responsibility for running a banking system as Chancellor of the Exchequer, if you've got responsibility over the Financial Service Authority, then that's where the responsibility lies.
If you've got the judgment that determines that your entire political career is built around an independent Scotland, you should have the judgment, surely, whether you're in power or not, as to whether this is a good thing or not, and it was a bad thing.
Yeah, well, obviously...
And yours for Scotland is a pretty damning statement.
Obviously, it wasn't a good thing. It was a bad thing. I'm pointing out the leader of the No campaign, the person who's advising Scotland not to run its own affairs, was in charge of the Financial Service Authority that allowed the Royal Bank to devalue its capital ratios and run into trouble. I think that's a pretty more damning sense of responsibility than somebody who writes Fred Goodwin a letter.
Nevertheless, if we are left with the situation as it stands now, Britain, England, whatever's left after Scotland's gone, will be responsible for your judgments over what happens to your two big banks. Well, and that could land us in a great deal of money. And I'm just saying, you're not going to be the lender of last resort. You're not, therefore, going to be independent. England is going to pick up your dirty laundry.
No, two different things. When the central bank's lender of the last resort, it makes a profit out of being lender of the last resort. That's just a fact. Financial intervention in terms of equity share, that's owned currently. That is an asset, and at some point it will be sold and will be an asset. We're putting forward a formula which recognises, of course, that the Royal Bank of Scotland, or HBOS for that matter, Lloyds as it is now, are not specifically Scottish banks. They're banks in terms of domestic assets, but the overwhelming majority, not just of the assets, but of the bad debt, occurred not in Scotland, but occurred here or in the international marketplace, supervised by the FSA and Alistair Darling.
They are located in Scotland. And the question is, upon independence, who gets them? Do you want them to be pushed south of the border so we bear the burden, or do we get to push them north of the border?
News for you, the headquarters of Lloyds Bank is in London. It's not in Scotland. You know, that's just another reality.
There's still a huge HBOS entity in Scotland, and it employs a large number of people.
It employs a large number of people, and we like to have as many banks as possible located in Scotland.
Do you want it there, or do you want it all to come down to England?
I'm pointing out we're putting forward a position whereby the Bank of England assumes that responsibility. We believe that the changes that are are taking place are designed to ensure that the sort of banking collapse and risk does not happen again. That's why we've supported these changes. But I'm also pointing out, I think that it's hardly a good argument for the No campaign when the leader of the No campaign was Chancellor of the Exchequer, who allowed these catastrophes, not just for Scotland, but for the UK and much wider afield, to happen under his
Sounds
watch.
like a no-score draw to me. I mean, you were the most prominent bidder for independence at the time. You thought that RBS should take over ABN AMRO. You thought it was a jolly good thing. Alistair Darling may have made wrong judgments too. It sounds like a no-score draw.
Well, in many things we're going to have a massively scored victory in terms of Scotland's track record, in terms of the areas which we do control, whether it be health or housing or education, where we run an excellent show. And that gives people the confidence to know that Scotland should also control our economy, our spending and our revenue. Because if we do that, we can build both a more prosperous but also a more just society in Scotland.
Let's just deal finally then with the politics. There have been some interesting recent polls. Why do you think women are more reluctant even than men over the whole question of independence?
Well, you say even than men. Actually, the poll which showed the gender difference, so there were a majority of men supporting independence. I think the key to it is in the number who don't know is, I think it's a challenge for the Yes campaign to put across our message in a way which appeals directly to women.
But why do you think it doesn't? Why doesn't it appeal to women?
There's a whole range.
Differences are quite big.
I think a lot of politics, and this applies to the constitutional debate, can often be conducted. You know, the Prime Minister sailed into Scotland a few weeks ago in a nuclear submarine. And
Are women off-put by that? Or attracted by it? Because after all, they're favouring him.
Well, I think the key to the gender issue in terms of the independence vote is putting across our message of hope, of expectation about the future in a way which appeals directly to the everyday lives of Scottish women. That's a challenge for us, and it's a challenge that we're prepared to meet.
Isn't it possible, and perhaps sort of to think of Margaret Thatcher for a moment and remember that basically the way she prevailed was by talking in terms of housekeeping and the rest of it? And don't you think that women who manage a family budget think their best prospects lie in a union rather than taking a gamble?
Well, two things. Margaret Thatcher did not ever prevail in Scotland, neither with Scottish women or Scottish men. And what will prevail, John, is a positive campaign that appeals to the future as opposed to a negative scaremongering campaign that often looks at the past. You know, in politics, I've learned one thing above all. If there's two negative campaigns, the most negative campaign wins. But a positive campaign will always trump a negative campaign, and that's what's going to happen in Scotland over these next 16 months.
What's the final percentage?
Well, I mean, you know, Harold Wilson once said, you know, one vote's enough, and what we're looking for is to win this referendum for the future of Scotland.
Alex Salmond, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.